graphics that integrate with live action footage. We'll also learn how to composite those motion graphics with the footage in a way that can make even the most graphically styled elements feel real. We begin by learning how to bring footage into Cinema 4D so that it can be animated over. We then use a bit of geometry to match move the basketball in the live shot. After getting the position and rotation of the real ball matched, we learn how to use sweeps and MoGraph tracers to create beautiful trailing graphics. Along the way, you'll learn some great tips for reducing your poly count in these situations for lightning fast renders. We also learn how to render this project to get the best render with the most useful passes for our composite. Once we move into After Effects, you'll learn how to use simple effects and rotoscoping to bring the basketball fire to life. We even learn a time-saving technique to create a realistic relighting of the actor's skin, as if the light from the ball were really being cast upon him. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to let you know that Digital Tutors would like to say thank you to Dissolve and the contributor Good Sport HD for their video that was used in this series of lessons. You can access this same video and thousands of others at dissolve.com. And by the end of this course, you'll learn how to use both Cinema 4D and After Effects to create amazing motion graphics that follow along with live action. Go ahead and get this project set up. So let's just go to our render and edit render settings. And I'm going to change this to a 1280 by 720 project. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave that frame rate at 30 frames per second. And I'm going to uncheck this save option because if we want to do any quick little renders to the picture viewer, I don't want them saving anywhere yet. Perfect. Let's go ahead and we'll X out of these render settings. And the next thing we want to do is bring in the footage that we will be working with in our project. So I'm going to create a new material and double click that material. And we're going to be putting our video that we're going to be animating on top of into our color channel. So I'll go ahead and uncheck the reflectance and we'll go to texture and choose load image. Okay, so we've gone ahead and clicked load the image, and if we go into Cinema 4D files and into that text folder, you can see that we have an AVI here that we can use. So I'll go ahead and open that up, and it is going to take a second for this to load in. Anytime you're adding a video as a texture, it takes a moment. There it is. You can see that's showing up. Now there's a couple of things we need to do to get this to start working for us. But before I do that, before you see the importance of those steps, let's just go ahead and see what happens if we try to put this in our perspective view. So I'll go ahead and just X out of this. And not to take a major detour, but the way that we're going to be watching this video is on a background object. So we need to add that background object first to be able to see the video. So let's just come up here to our floor button, left click and hold and drag down to background. And then we'll just take that texture and drop it on the background object. Now, a really cool thing about this is that no matter how I rotate around the scene, that background object is always going to stay the same. So you don't have to worry about being lined up just perfectly. However, once you start animating and you have a camera, you want to make sure that you're staying in place with that camera and you're not moving it around, or your render won't match up in the end. Now, if I hit play, you can see that we're not able to see any movement here, and we know we added a video. It was an AVI, so there's something we need to change over here in our material options. Another issue is that we're only getting to frame 90. By default, we get 90 frames on our timeline, but this clip is actually 177 frames. I just know that because I've been working with it. And there's another way that we can see actually how many frames that clip is equal to in our settings. So let's go find that number and let's set this up so we can watch it actually play back here. So I'll go ahead and pause again and we'll double click to open that material. The first thing I want to take care of is I want this to be able to play back. So you'll go down to the editor option and choose animate preview, and that's going to allow this to play back for us. Now I'm going to go back up to my color channel and click the little postage stamp we see for our video. And now we've got some options for this video. Now I don't really need to change the exposure or anything like that, so I'm going to go to my animation tab, and you can see now we've got a few pieces of important information. So one of them is that our timing is set to exact second, and our other option is exact frame. So I'm going to choose that because I want this to be more accurate. We also see that our movie end frame is 177, so I can come in here and change this to 177 so that we have the accurate amount of frames on our timeline to work with. And we also see the movie frame rate is set to 24. Now, because we're working in a project that is 30 frames per second, I'm going to go ahead and change this to be interpreted as 30 frames for the movie. Now, I'll also go ahead and hit calculate to just kind of recalculate the way that all of that is working together now that we've changed a few options. And once that hourglass is done and it's finished calculating, now we're ready to close the material editor and hit play, and we can watch this clip play back. Very, very cool. Now, one thing I just want to point out to you was that that piece of footage was an AVI, not an MP4, and sometimes Cinema 4D has trouble playing with MP4s when you're using it as an animated texture. It works much better with .avis. So that's why we're using an AVI, which is a slightly less universal format as far as playing back on all types of devices, but as far as being compatible with Cinema 4D, an AVI is working really well for me. Now, the next thing we want to do is bring in something that we're going to be using to match move the position of this basketball. And the little black lines on a basketball are called ribs. And I have a little project in Cinema 4D that is just the ribs of a basketball, and we're going to be using that to be able to kind of match the movements of this basketball so that later on when we get to After Effects and we start compositing, we have something really cool to work with. So to be able to get to that, we'll go to File and choose Open, and I'm just going to come in here to your Cinema 4D files, or rather your reference files. There it is, and it is a Cinema 4D file. It's the basketball_ribs. You'll just want to select that and open it, and it's going to open as another project. Now, one of the first things I want to do is whenever I have this selected and I'm in object mode, you can see that the axis is down here at the bottom, and for us to be able to get some good animation, we want that axis to be right in the middle. So I'm just going to middle click, and we can come in here to this front view, and I'm just going to click the enable axis, and we'll move that up right there into the middle. Perfect. So maybe just a little bit higher there. And that's going to just allow us to have a slightly more accurate animation. And it's going to be a lot easier to work with. So then I'll right click, or rather just select the ribs and hit Control C. We can just use keyboard shortcuts. So select the ribs, hit Control C, then we'll go to Window and go back to our 02_begin Cinema 4D project, and we'll hit Control V to paste. And you can see there are the ribs. Now I'm also going to add a camera that we will look through from now on. So you can kind of position this however you want it to be. And then looking through the camera, you'll want to do that. So you want to have this little white object checked on here. And that looks pretty good as far as sort of matching up with the floor. Now, we don't actually have a match move shot to work with as far as a solved camera. This is a really hard shot to solve because it has mostly only rotational values, and it's got a lot of wide open spaces, which is just kind of a perfect storm for a bad solve. So because we're not solving the camera and we still need to have a camera, I'm just going to place the camera in here, and we'll add a protection tag. So you want to go to Tag Cinema 4D Tags and choose Protection, and that's going to keep us now from being able to rotate the camera around. I'm holding Alt, left clicking, no rotation, and now I can start to come in here and get this basketball and the threads or the ribs rather kind of matched up with the ball. So you can kind of see what that would start to look like when we started doing this. Now there's a few other things I need to add to this to get it in place, but let's just go ahead and move on to our next lesson where we'll be matching the ball's position and rotations with the ball in the shot. So we kind of have everything set up, and now we're getting ready to start matching those a little bit better. Now one thing that I want to do is really just use kind of the first 60 or so frames of this as sort of just an establishing shot. So I don't even want to really start matching up these animations until frame 60. So that's going to make our job a little bit easier. And I can just come in here and start matching up that rotation and putting these ribs into place. And you can see I'm running into a little bit of an issue here where the back of the ribs are sort of interfering with the front, and it's hard to tell what's what. And there's a tag we can add to those ribs to help that from happening. So with the ribs object selected, we'll go to Tags, Cinema 4D Tags, and add a display tag that we can then check on the back face culling option. So if you check on use, you'll see the back face is now kind of just a little bit less visible. You can still see it kind of disappearing back there, but it makes it way more obvious what's what and makes it a lot easier to work with. So now I can much more quickly get this ball into place and be able to start using it much more efficiently. Okay, so this is looking pretty good, but our rotation is still a little off. So let's switch over to rotation, and I'm just going to kind of pull this around, just trying to get that into place. Maybe start with this band right here, and it looks like this needs to go over. Now, it might be a temptation at this point to say, oh, it's just a little too small, let's scale it up. Now, that is not going to give us an accurate representation of the depth we want to get out of this. So don't use the scale once you get this into place. Don't mess around with the scale, just only use the position coordinates to get it where it needs to go. And that is a little bit more challenging, but we'll have a way better result when we start compositing it later on. And you'll also notice that these ribs get a lot closer together in the middle than what we have on the real basketball, and that's okay. Don't worry too much about that. We just want to get it as close as possible so that we're matching those positions and rotations. Okay, this looks great. Let's go ahead and select our ribs and go to the coordinate tab, and I'm just going to key everything in for the positions just by control clicking those little dots, and also the rotation. So position rotation is keyed for frame 60, and then let's go to our next major keyframe. So that's going to be kind of where this hits the ground right about there. So then let's start messing with this to get that into place. So you can see it's really actually quite a lot of just hand done work here, and that's okay. That's really what this is about, is getting this as perfectly matched as we can, all done by hand, so that once we start compositing this, we have a really beautiful final result. And that actually looks like that's matching up pretty closely. You might want to rotate that around just a bit there, but that looks great. So let's go ahead and key there as well. Now you're going to notice that in between, this isn't matching up perfectly, so you'll need to add some more in between keys. But let's move on from here and just kind of get a little bit farther. So this is going to be a challenging part because you can see this starts to rotate backwards. So I would recommend rotating every few frames to kind of just get your bearings a little bit, because it can start to get a little confusing for where you were. And when you're only working a few frames at a time, it does make it a lot easier to keep up with rather than scooting way ahead or behind on your timeline. Now, I'm going to go ahead and key this, but I'm not positive if I'm in the right spot. So I'm going to key here, and then we'll just move back one frame and kind of watch this. So you can see sort of what you have to do is match it up frame by frame to be able to see that movement. So I'm here, and then I'm going forward one frame right here, And it's just a very subtle change, but it can be harder to see how that ball moved. So just kind of right in there. And if you're working on this on your own computer, it will be a little bit easier for you because you'll be able to make this window bigger so you can see those threads a little bit more clearly, a little bit easier. Okay, so that looks pretty good right there. So we'll go ahead and key that. And that's just going to make those transitions easier when you start figuring that out. So you can see that is a little bit easier to tell where the ball is at and how it should go. Now, I am not going to make you watch me match move this for all the frames. I know you might have been getting a little bit excited about watching 50 lessons of me doing this all by hand, but that's too bad. I'm not going to show all of that. So what we'll do is just move on to our next lesson where I will have this magically completed, and then we'll get to move on to actually using the information we get out of having this match moved basketball and the camera already in place. Everything's there. It's magic. So that's really going to speed our process along. As practice, you should go through and work on match moving that yourself, and you'll really have a better understanding of how the ball is moving and how the rotation is working. And one thing that's also helpful when you're going through and doing this yourself is to go ahead and, even though you're maybe trying to gauge the rotation, leave it in move mode, because then you can see these axes. And if you're in this world mode, it's not going to work, the coordinate system. But if you're in object mode, you can see how it's rotating, and it gives you a better idea of if you've added way too much rotation. So if I maybe just went way forward here and said, okay, you know, this needs to go down like this, and then pull this forward, you know, and I just kind of am going too fast and skipping ahead, I would be able to tell really quickly if the ball was moving more than what I was giving it time for. So let me just kind of show you the downfall of doing that. So if I key that there, you can see that the ball is obviously spinning way more than what I'm doing, and I can just barely, you know, see any of that movement. So you can tell a lot easier when those axes are sticking out that if it's moving properly, or if you've added too much rotation. So it kind of goes both ways. So that's going to be a tool for you to be able to use to help your match moving. And we'll come back in our next lesson. This will all be done, and you can skip ahead or work on that a little bit on your own. And we'll just be back in the next lesson to create a sweep of the ball's path. I'm going to select those ribs so you can see what I was talking about with the handles or the axes and how they move around with the ball. So it's pretty cool to see that once it's all done, and just how beautifully that moves through the air. Great. So what I want to do now is create a sweep that follows along and creates a trail behind this ball. Now, if I try to create the trail just using the ribs, and I go into point mode, you can see how many points this has. And the trails will be created behind all of those points. And that's not what I want. I want just kind of one central trail coming out of the middle. So the easiest way to do that is just to copy and paste the keyframes we have on the ribs object to a null object. So we'll just go ahead and add a null and select our ribs, and I'm just going to increase the value of our frames for a second to something like 250, so we just have a little bit of a longer extension. And then I'm going to drag a box around these guys, and then just kind of moving back there, I'll right click, copy, and then go to the null and right click paste. Okay, and that is going to start me, let's see, we just want those to line right up perfectly there on frame 60. So we can switch that back to 177 and then click back here to deselect. Okay, so now that null object is going to move exactly the same as the ribs, except it's just one point right in the middle. So The next thing we want to do is create a MoGraph tracer, and that's going to trace the position of this null through space and give us a spline, just kind of like the one we see here that is the motion path of the ribs, and give us something to work with. So I'm going to go to MoGraph, we'll go to Tracer, and because I had that null selected, it automatically dropped the null in as my trace link in the MoGraph tracer. But if you don't have that, you can just select the tracer and left click and drag the null into the trace link, and that will work as well. Now let's start looking at this tracer and what's it going to create for us. So if I drag through here, you can see we've got this really cool little spline that it's making. So I want to start editing that a little bit because I don't want it to create a trail that we see literally the whole time. I want it to kind of follow along more like a tail. So to do that, you're going to go into your limit inside the MoGraph tracer and change that from none to from end. Now if I go back to the beginning and start trying to drag forward, I'm not going to see anything because the amount from the end is defaulting to 1. So I need to increase that to something like 20. Okay, so now if I hit play, you can see we've got about 20 frames trailing along behind the ball, and that's just what I'm looking for. Now I would like it to be a little bit longer at the beginning because we are still going kind of slowly here when this moves down. So I'd like that to stay up there for a little bit longer, and then maybe when it hits the ground is whenever we start to see that kind of go back down. So let's say that when we're on frame 80 or so, we'll key this in at about 70. So we're going to crank that up. And I'll just go ahead and control click to key that. And then you'll go forward to just kind of right after here, after he grabs the ball again, after it's hit the ground, and we'll take that back down to 20, kind of where we liked it for the rest of it. So now I'll go all the way back to the beginning, just double click that from start button, and then we can see that now we've got a little bit longer tail at the beginning that then squeezes down to that 20 frame trail instead. You can kind of see that changing over time right here. Okay, so that's perfect. We've got the tracer looking the way we want it to. Now let's go ahead and start working on creating the sweep that uses the spline. So I'm going to pause for a second, and we'll come up here and create a sweep. And we also need a circle to sweep along that tracer's path. So we'll come in here and add a circle. Now the circle is always a lot bigger than we need it to be. So I'm just going to kind of make that a little bit smaller here. And then let's just drop that under the sweep, and then let's add the tracer just right there underneath the circle. Now if we go back to the beginning and I hit play, you can see we're creating this really ugly tube behind our basketball. So we need to do a little bit more fine tuning to get this looking more like we want it to. Now, as I said, I want it to kind of look like a tail. So that means it's going to be skinnier at the tip here than it is where it attaches to the ball. So let's go ahead and do that. That is going to be controlled through both the tracer and the sweep. So first we'll go into the sweep, and where it says end scale, we're just going to turn that all the way down to 0. But you see that's backwards, where the skinny part is what's attaching, and that's not what we want. So we'll go into our tracer then and come down here to the very bottom, and it says reverse sequence. And when we check that on, now we've got the ball attaching in a way that looks much more like the tail that we're going for. Very cool. Now, another issue that we're having is that whenever we're in this little spot right here, we get a really harsh turn. So let's go into our tracer and see if we can't fix that. Now, I'm also going to turn on my Garot shading with lines for a moment so you can see that we've got probably too many subdivisions in here. Now, one of the issues is that we've got too many subdivisions around. We don't need that many. So that means we've got an issue in our circle, that it has too many subdivisions. But we don't have enough subdivisions in the length, and that's why we're getting this harsh point. So we need to add more subdivisions to the length and take them away from the circumference. So to fix the length subdivisions, that's going to be in the tracer. So with the tracer selected, we'll go to our intermediate points, and where that says none, I'm going to change it to adaptive. and I'm going to change the type from linear to Bezier so that we get control over this angle, and then we can change it from 90 and turn it down so that this really starts to get more curved. And I'm going to take it down pretty low, something like 5, and it looks like, oh my gosh, way too many subdivisions. But we can fix that by going into the circle and taking away some of our subdivisions. So in the circle, we'll change this. This is already set to adaptive, so that's good, and we have access to the angle here. And so instead of the angle being low at 5, we'll turn it up, kind of the opposite of what we did, and take that to something like 25. You might even be able to get away with something smaller, but I don't want to have so few subdivisions that we get any kind of jagged edges. So we're going to get some jagged edges anyway, just because the movement of the ball is erratic because it's going so quickly. So that looks much better, much more fluid now that we have the angles kind of fixed on both the tracer and the circle. And it looks like our hierarchy is looking really good with the sweep. Everything's moving along as it should. So let's come back in our next lesson and we'll create some materials and add a few compositing tags to really start getting this looking the way that we want. And we may even be able to set off a quick render to show kind of what this is going to look like, just as that sort of a flat color is what we're going to be going for. So I'll show you on our sweep here. So I'm going to go to create new material, and I want it to be kind of an orange color, and because I want it to look very flat, I'm just going to dump it into the luminance channel and turn off the color and reflective. So if we go into our luminance and go into our color there, I can just kind of create this sort of bright orangish color. And make sure you check on luminance, and maybe just take that back a little closer to red. There we go. Perfect. And I'm going to drop that on my sweep. Okay, so if I go back to the beginning and I start scrubbing through, you can see what this kind of looks like. Now, one of the issues I'm getting is that this tail looks like it's beginning kind of inside the ball and not like the whole ball is really glowing, and that's really more of what I want to create with this. Now, once we get here, it's not as noticeable, but we still just kind of are having an issue at the very beginning when that looks really flat. Because we're seeing sort of the edge of that circle. So a great way to get around this is just to add a sphere that has all that same information that we've gotten from our null. So I'll just go ahead and drop in a sphere, and we'll also come in here and again extend our timeline out so we can copy and paste those keyframes really easily. So just kind of moving my current time indicator back here, right clicking and copying, then selecting the sphere, right clicking and pasting, and then we'll just drag those frames back so we are making sure that they are right there on frame 60. And then we can deselect and take that back down to the 177 frames. Okay, so it actually looks like we might be missing a few frames right there at the very end. So let's see if maybe we just didn't have everything selected there. And yeah, it looks like a few got left off. So rather than trying to match them up, I'm just going to select those and delete them and then right click and paste again. Looks like it doesn't want to let us do that. So we'll just copy from the null and paste to a new sphere here. There we go. So we might need to extend that timeline just a little bit more because our frames kind of got away from us. So just pulling that back down there and making sure we have all of them perfectly there on the edge. Okay, so that just took a little bit of extra time, but we want to make sure we've got all the frames, and there we have them all the way to the end. Okay, perfect. Now we want to get the size right for this sphere. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning and then kind of scrub forward to when this very first starts to move down right about there, and then we'll grab our sphere and go to our scale and I'm just going to scale this down so that it's kind of right inside of the threads. So I don't want it to cover up the threads, or rather the ribs. I just want it to be kind of right inside there. So you can see that's what it looks like. It just doesn't have a different color to really distinguish it. So I'm going to go ahead and add a color to the sphere, and then you can see if you're kind of obscuring it a little bit easier. So just right inside of there, so no faces are being obscured, and that looks pretty good right there. So now what we're going to get is just a little bit more realistic looking sweep along that ball. But one issue that we have is that the ribs are obscured now by that sweep, which we really didn't care about as much earlier. You didn't notice it. But that's going to play into how we render this, because I want to have a really clear visibility of just the ribs and then a really clear pass that just has the color. So that's going to require us to render this out in two separate passes. We're also going to want to be able to cut this orange out from the background. We are not going to be rendering our background out with this color out of Cinema 4D. We'll want to composite them together in After Effects. So what we need to do is add some compositing tags to our sphere and our sweep and actually turn off the ribs and the background for now. So I'm going to turn off their visibility in the renderer and the editor, and then in the sphere and the sweep we want to add a compositing tag that will allow us to render an object buffer. So we'll go to Tags, Cinema 4D, Tags, and we'll go to Compositing, and we'll go to Object Buffer and check on Buffer 1, and then you can just control drag that down to your sweep. So now we've got both the sweep and the sphere located in Object Buffer 1, and you can kind of see what this looks like, and it looks really, really good actually. So let's go ahead and do a quick little test render, just one frame, to see what it looks like. So we'll go to our render settings, make sure that's just set to the current frame, we're not saving it, and let's just see what happens. So I'll just hit Shift R, and you can see if I move this over here, the color looks great, but if I move to layer, I don't see my object buffer. And that's because we need to add the object buffer in as a multipass. So let's go back to our render settings, and we need to check on multipass, and then when we're in our save over here, you can see multipass is now available when it's checked on. Then to actually get the multipass to work, we need to go into this little multipass button and add our object buffer, and it's automatically going to default to group ID 1, which is what we want. Okay, so now we've got our object buffer, and we've got our multipass, and we've got our save. It's just not checked on to save, but we have it there. So now let's go ahead and try that little test render again. So I'll hit Shift R again, and you can see already we've got something different happening over here. So I'm going to switch over to single pass, and you can see that I can click between my background and my object buffer, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted it to look like. Okay, so now we're ready to start rendering this. So let's go ahead and go to Render and edit our render settings, because we need to say where we want this to save to. So I'm going to check on the save, and we'll come over here and click our little dot 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 so we can define the path for the save. Okay, so I'm here in your project files, and we'll go into your reference files folder. I'm just going to right click and create a new folder, and we'll call this color and buffer. We'll do buffers plural because we're actually going to end up with 2 buffers. Okay, so then we'll go in here, and this one I clicked on the dot 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 for the color. So we're going to just say that this is the color. And then for the multipass, we'll go into the same place and just call this buffer 1. Save that. Now I don't want a multi-layer file for this, and I also don't want this to be saved out as a PSD sequence, so I'm going to change that to be PSD layers but just TIFFs. And we don't need this to be 18-bit because we're just going to be using the Luminance, so we can switch that back to 8-bit. This is just, we want this to be super fast and small file sizes, and it's going to look just as good for us in our particular situation. So we can leave that as it is. That looks good. We've got our multipass, we've got our object buffer. If we go to our output though, we want to change from current frame to all frames because we want to render all of these. And everything looks good. So now we need to save our project as the we're in 05 begin right now. I'm just going to save it as 05 end so that we can render from it. So I'll hit save as, and we'll just set that up as 05 end. And now we're ready to add it to our render queue. So I'll go to render, add to render queue. We'll give that a second to queue up. And there it is. So with that selected, we'll just go ahead and hit render, and you can see that it is a super fast render. So looks like all of our frames made it in here, and we're rendering away. So we're going to come back in the next lesson and render our rib pass. So it's going to be a little bit different, but once we get into After Effects and you see the passes we ended up with, it's really going to start to make sense of why we wanted two separate passes, one for the color and one for the object buffer for the color, and then actually a third pass for the rib.